Tonight, we chase a mystery that has haunted the world for over 700 years. A fleet of ships that vanished into the night, carrying with it treasure, relics, and secrets too dangerous to remain in sight. The year was 1307. King Philip moved to crush the Templars, seizing their halls and prisons with fire and sword. Yet when his men stormed the vaults, they found nothing. No gold, no relics, no maps, only silence, as if the order had been warned and had slipped away into the dark. From that moment, the questions began. Did the ships flee north to Scotland and aid in battles that turned the tide of nations? Did they sail south to Portugal, reborn as the Order of Christ and planting the seeds of global exploration? Or did they vanish westward, centuries before Columbus, leaving clues on hidden islands and in carved stone? This is not just the story of missing ships. It is the story of knowledge scattered, power disguised, and symbols that still echo in our world today. The Templar fleet did not vanish into nothing. It left a trail, faint but undeniable, waiting for those who dare to follow it. So, before you dismiss this as legend, ask yourself, what if the greatest treasure was never gold, but survival itself? Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we sail with the missing Templar fleet, and some mysteries refuse to sink. Close your eyes and imagine this. It is the dead of night in Paris. The year is 1307, the month of October, and the city is restless under a cold sky. Torches burn low in the streets, boots echo on cobblestones, and orders are whispered like poison in the dark. Across France, hundreds of riders gallop out from castles and royal halls, all carrying the same command from King Philip IV. Arrest the Knights Templar, every last one of them. The timing is exact. The precision is chilling. In a single sweep, the most powerful military order in Christendom is to be erased. But here is the mystery. When the king's men storm the Templar headquarters in Paris, when they break through doors and tear apart chambers, searching for gold, for silver, for the rumoured fortune that fueled kings and built cathedrals, they find nothing. The vaults are empty. The treasure of the temple has vanished. Imagine the shock. For years, the Templars were whispered about as guardians of endless wealth. They held lands across Europe, fortresses in the Holy Land, fleets of ships, even the trust of kings and popes. They invented a banking system so advanced it made lords dependent on them. Yet in the very moment of their downfall, when the crown moves to seize everything, their coffers are bare. What happened in those last hours before the betrayal? Some say the Templars knew that their spies inside the French court warned them of Philip's plan, and so the order had time to prepare. The gold, the relics, the documents, all spirited away under the cover of night. Others believe it was not just wealth that vanished, but something far more dangerous. Secrets that could shake both crown and church. Picture the scene in the temple's great hall as the king's soldiers crash through the doors. They expect resistance, but instead they find confusion. Knights pulled from their beds, bewildered, unarmed. Documents burning in hearths, smoke curling like ghosts into the rafters. Chests overturned, not filled with coins but empty, as if they had been deliberately left that way. The commander of the garrison is dragged out into the street. Behind him, the halls echo with silence. Not the silence of defeat, but of absence. Whatever was once there is already gone. And here is where the story sharpens. Because witnesses in La Rochelle, the Templars' coastal stronghold, claim they saw ships leaving harbour just days before the arrests. 12, maybe more, their sails full in the night wind, heading out into the Atlantic. Did those ships carry the missing treasure? Did they carry relics from Jerusalem guarded for generations? Or did they carry people, fleeing into exile with secrets too dangerous to fall into Philip's hands? The betrayal of October 13th, 1307, was meant to be the end of the Templars. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery that has endured for 7 centuries. Because while the knights themselves were chained and burned, the fleet, the treasure, the legacy, all slipped into shadow, and the question still lingers today. On that night of betrayal, when Paris fell silent and the vaults stood empty, where did it all go? Gold that could bankroll crusades, silver that could buy kingdoms, wealth so vast it turned a band of warrior monks into the most feared bankers in Europe. That was the reputation of the Knights Templar. Yet on the morning after their sudden arrest in October of 1307, when royal soldiers ransacked their halls and opened their vaults, the fortune that everyone swore existed was gone. Imagine the disbelief. King Philip IV had counted on it. He owed the Templars more money than he could ever repay, and their downfall was meant to be his financial salvation. But when the soldiers pried open coffers, they found nothing. No golden chalices, no towers of coins, not even the sacred relics that rumour claimed they guarded. It was as though centuries of treasure had simply dissolved into the night. This was no ordinary disappearance. The Templars were not careless men. They had built a network of commanderies across Europe, each one a miniature fortress, each one linked to the others by coded letters and disciplined secrecy. Their vaults were guarded not just by walls, but by a system of trust that kings themselves had come to depend on. Pilgrims travelled across continents with nothing in hand but a letter from the Templars, redeemable for safe passage and coin in lands thousands of miles away. These men practically invented international banking, so when their wealth disappeared, it was not clumsiness, it was intention. Theories multiply like shadows. Some believe the treasure was never kept in Paris at all, that the Templars, sensing Philip's growing hostility, had long before moved their assets out of reach. Their stronghold at La Rochelle, perched on the Atlantic coast, becomes the centre of whispers. Fleets of ships were anchored there, capable of moving gold and relics faster than any king's men could react. Others suggest the treasure had been dispersed quietly into Allied hands. Noble families in Portugal, Aragon, even Scotland, who had reason to protect the order. If so, the Templar fortune may not have vanished, but scattered like seeds, invisible yet still growing. Then there is the darker theory, that the treasure was never gold or silver at all, that what Philip sought could not be weighed on scales or melted into coins. Some say the true wealth of the Templars was knowledge. Documents, maps, secrets carried from the ruins of Jerusalem after the First Crusade. Ancient scrolls from beneath the Temple Mount, wisdom too dangerous to leave in any one vault. If that is true, then the soldiers searching Paris in 1307 never stood a chance of finding what they wanted. The treasure was never in their hands to begin with. What we know for certain is this: Philip's gamble failed. His men captured the knights, tortured them, and paraded them through streets in chains. But the one thing he wanted most, the fortune that would erase his debts and secure his throne, remained out of reach. It was as if the Templars had planned for this very night, rehearsed it, and when the hammer finally fell, they slipped the noose with chilling precision, and so the question lingers like smoke. Did the Templars spirit their treasure away in the hours before their arrest? Or had they hidden it years in advance, waiting for the moment when their enemies would strike? Whatever the answer, the vanishing of that gold turned the fall of the Templars from a victory for the crown into one of the greatest mysteries of history. The sea has always swallowed secrets. Along the western coast of France, in the bustling medieval port of La Rochelle, whispers still drift like salt on the wind. It was here, days before October 13th of 1307, that people claimed to see the Knights Templars' ships slip quietly out of harbour. Not one vessel, but a fleet, sails full in the autumn breeze, vanishing into the Atlantic with no record of where they went. Imagine the scene: fishermen preparing their nets, merchants unloading cargo, and in the dead of night, ships armoured in secrecy, cutting through the black water, leaving behind only ripples that faded with the tide. La Rochelle was no ordinary harbour. For the Templars, it was a fortress as well as a gateway. High walls rose above the docks, warehouses filled with supplies lined the shore, and its position gave the knights direct access to the Atlantic trade routes. It was the perfect staging ground for an escape. Unlike Paris, where the king's men could march in at a moment's notice, La Rochelle opened directly to the ocean, a door that led to everywhere and nowhere. If the Templars knew their end was coming, this was where they would run. Some chronicles mention the number 12, 12 ships unmoored, carrying treasure, knights, and something more precious still. Others say it was 18. Still others insist the fleet was far larger, a hidden armada waiting for a signal that never appeared in any official record. What they all agree on is this: when the king's soldiers finally arrived to seize the port, the docks were nearly empty. Whatever was meant to be there had already gone, but where did they sail? Theories stretch across oceans. One suggests Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Church, might have welcomed the Templars as allies. Another points to Portugal, where the order would later be reborn as the Knights of Christ. A more daring idea claims they crossed the Atlantic itself, centuries before Columbus, guided by maps older than Europe dared admit. Each theory feels impossible, yet each one carries just enough evidence to make it impossible to dismiss. The truth may be hidden in fragments. Records in French court archives speak of sudden shortages of grain and supplies near La Rochelle, as though provisions had been purchased in bulk and loaded in haste. Local legends tell of strange coins found washed ashore, stamped with symbols no merchant could identify. And then there is the silence. After 1307, La Rochelle's connection to the Templars simply ends, as if the chapter was torn out of the book. Stand at the harbour today, and you can almost feel it. The creak of ropes, the slap of waves against hulls, the hurried shouts of men loading cargo under the cover of darkness. Somewhere in that night, a decision was made, one that would echo for centuries. The treasure of the Templars may not have been gold at all. It may have been the fleet itself, ships carrying freedom, knowledge, and the ability to vanish into the unknown. The ocean took them, and history never wrote them down again. That is why La Rochelle is not just a port. It is the beginning of a mystery that has never reached its end. The story of the missing Templar fleet is like a riddle that no one has ever solved. Some chronicles swear that 12 ships vanished from La Rochelle, slipping into the night with sails heavy and decks loaded. Others raise the number to 18, as if nearly a full armada disappeared before the king's soldiers could arrive. Still other accounts claim nothing escaped at all, insisting that the fleet is a myth invented by later storytellers. The truth is lost in the fog of time, and that uncertainty is what keeps the mystery alive. Think of it like this: the Templars were not ordinary men, and their ships were not ordinary ships. Each one was a fortress on water, armed and ready, built for long voyages. If even a handful managed to escape, it would have been enough to carry treasure, relics, or secrets far beyond the reach of Philip IV. But with no records, no surviving logbooks, and no eyewitness testimony that can be confirmed, the number of ships becomes more than just a detail. It becomes a key to the whole story. 12 ships feels almost symbolic. 12 apostles, 12 guardians, 12 vessels chosen to carry the Order's greatest secrets into exile. 18 suggests something larger, almost like an evacuation, a deliberate flight carrying not just gold, but brothers, families, and knowledge. And then there is the possibility of none. Perhaps the story of the fleet was born out of desperation, a rumour spread to give hope to captured knights as they faced the dungeons and fires of Philip's wrath. If so, then the greatest escape of all time might never have happened. But the silence is suspicious. French royal records describe the confiscation of Templar lands, their castles, their churches, even their livestock. Yet, there is no mention of ships seized in La Rochelle. Why would that be? The port was one of their most valuable assets, and ships of that size would not simply vanish without comment, unless, of course, they had already gone. Legends fill in the gaps. Fishermen told their children of seeing sails fade on the horizon days before the arrests. Monks whispered of carts of gold being loaded onto ships at night. Even centuries later, treasure hunters and explorers looked for signs of a fleet that seemed to disappear like smoke. None of these stories can be proven, but all of them refuse to die. The lack of proof only sharpens the mystery. History usually leaves footprints, documents, letters, cargo lists, something. But here there is only silence, and silence itself can be evidence. It suggests erasure, deliberate omission, a story scrubbed from the record because it was too dangerous to be told. So how many ships really left La Rochelle in that fateful October of 1307? 12, 18, or none at all? The question may never be answered with certainty. But what is certain is this: the uncertainty itself fuels the legend. A fleet without a trace, a treasure without a vault, a story without an ending. That is why the mystery endures. Not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. The cold waters of the North Sea crash against rocky cliffs, the wind howling through jagged coves where ships could hide unseen. This is Scotland's rugged coastline, a place of storms and silence, where legends say the missing Templar fleet found refuge after fleeing France in 1307. The story lingers in fishing villages and old manuscripts, hinting that the knights sailed north and offered their swords and secrets to a king in desperate need, Robert the Bruce. At the time, Scotland was fighting for its very survival. Robert had been excommunicated by the Pope after killing his rival in a church. His claim to the throne was shaky, his support fragile, and his army outnumbered by English forces. Yet in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce achieved a stunning victory against King Edward II of England, a victory so unexpected it reshaped the future of Scotland. What turned the tide that day? Some say the answer may lie in the shadows of the Templars. Imagine a weary fleet sailing into hidden harbours along the Scottish coast. The knights, hunted across Europe, would have found a natural ally in Robert, a man already condemned by Rome. The Church had branded them both as outcasts. For the Templars, Scotland may have been one of the last safe havens left. The rocky inlets near Argyll, the secluded bays of the Hebrides, places unreachable by royal patrols, offered shelter where ships could anchor and vanish from sight. The idea becomes even more intriguing when you consider Bannockburn itself. Eyewitness accounts speak of a sudden charge that broke the English lines, led by men in strange armour, disciplined and fearless, appearing almost from nowhere. Could these have been remnants of the Templar Order, warriors who had trained for decades in the Holy Land, now fighting one last battle under a different banner? Chroniclers never name them directly, but the descriptions match the kind of cavalry the Templars were famous for. Heavily armed, mounted, and unstoppable. Skeptics dismiss this as romantic myth. They argue that Robert's victory was due to strategy, terrain, and the determination of his men. Yet the legend persists because it fills a gap, an unexplained moment when the tide of history shifted more dramatically than anyone expected. And if the fleet really did reach Scotland, if their ships carried not only treasure but battle-hardened knights, it would explain how an outlaw king managed to defeat an empire. Today, along Scotland's coasts, ruins of chapels and crosses still bear carvings linked to the Templars. Some claim the order blended into local clans, marrying, building, leaving behind only faint marks of their presence. Others believe the fleet scattered again after Bannockburn, continuing their secret mission under new names. Standing on those silent harbours now, the sea wind in your face, it is easy to picture them. Sails lowered, anchors dropped, men stepping onto stony beaches with their armour gleaming in the moonlight. They had lost their order, their power, their homeland, but here in Scotland they found something else, a chance to endure. And maybe, just maybe, they left their mark not only on the battlefield but on the very destiny of a nation. The story of the Templars in Portugal is unlike anywhere else in Europe. While in France, they were dragged from their beds, tortured, and burned. In Portugal, the order was not destroyed. Instead, it was reborn. King Dinis of Portugal refused to carry out Pope Clement's orders to eliminate the Templars. He admired their discipline, valued their skills, and understood how much they had given to defend his kingdom. So, rather than vanish, the Knights were given new life under a different name. In 1314, the Order of Christ was founded, and into it flowed the men, lands, and wealth of the Templars. For the Knights who escaped France, Portugal became more than a refuge. It was a resurrection. The question then is simple. Did the missing fleet sail here? La Rochelle lies directly north of Portugal's shores, and a well-organised voyage could have brought the ships safely into friendly harbours long before Philip's men realised they were gone. If the treasure truly vanished at sea, Portugal seems like the perfect destination, safe, loyal, and willing to protect what others wanted to destroy. Imagine the scene. Ships entering the Tagus River, their white sails marked with the red cross of the Order, slipping silently toward Lisbon as the sun rose over its hills. In their holds, not only gold and relics, but the very heartbeat of the Templar legacy. What makes this theory so convincing is what came after. The Order of Christ grew into one of the most powerful forces in Portuguese history. They inherited Templar castles, including the great fortress of Tomar, whose round chapel still carries the sacred geometry of the Old Order. They preserved rituals, symbols, and traditions, only slightly altered to satisfy the Pope. But perhaps their greatest gift was knowledge. Maps, navigation, and the daring spirit of exploration that would one day launch Portugal into the age of discovery. Look closely at the history of the 15th century, and you will see the fingerprints of the Templars everywhere. Prince Henry the Navigator, often credited with sparking the great voyages of exploration, was the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his leadership, fleets sailed further than ever before, down the coast of Africa and across uncharted seas. Caravels carried the same red cross on their sails that once marked the shields of knights in Jerusalem. The Templar symbol had transformed, not into a sword, but into a compass. Some believe this was no coincidence, that the missing fleet did not just bring treasure to Portugal, but charts and secrets carried from the east. Knowledge of winds, currents, and lands far beyond Europe's horizon. Perhaps even proof that voyages across the Atlantic were possible centuries before Columbus. If true, then the Templar fleet did not simply vanish. It shifted its mission, from defending holy lands to unlocking the edges of the world. Stand inside the fortress of Tomar today, and the walls still speak. Carvings of crosses, symbols of ships, traces of rituals hidden in stone. The silence of those halls suggests not death, but endurance. The fleet may have fled France in fear, but in Portugal it found a sanctuary, a place where the Order was not just saved, but transformed into something that would change the course of history. The Alps rise like walls of stone, sharp peaks cutting into the sky, valleys buried in snow, and passes so narrow they swallow whole armies. It is here, in the cold silence of Switzerland, that some believe the Knights Templar fled after their fall in 1307. Unlike the open sea, the mountains offered secrecy. Unlike crowded ports, they offered hidden vaults and caves no king could ever reach. And unlike France, Switzerland had no monarch strong enough to betray them. For fugitives carrying treasure and knowledge, it was the perfect refuge. The theory suggests that the missing wealth of the Templars was carried inland, over winding roads, and into mountain strongholds. Hidden caverns and monasteries became their vaults. Gold and silver may have been smuggled into secret chambers carved into rock. But more than that, the Order's greatest treasure, its records, its banking system, its coded documents, may have been planted like seeds in Swiss soil. Out of this, some say, grew the beginnings of Swiss banking, a tradition of secrecy and security that endures to this day. Think about it. The Templars had invented early versions of checks, promissory notes, and credit systems centuries before anyone else. Pilgrims could travel without carrying gold, simply exchanging letters in different commanderies. That knowledge did not vanish when Philip of France lit his pyres. It survived with the men who escaped, and where better to continue it than in Switzerland, a land of valleys and fortresses, cut off from powerful kings and protected by rugged terrain. By the 14th century, Swiss cantons were already earning reputations as fiercely independent, resisting outside control. The Templar spirit would have thrived there. There are clues that tie them together. Some of the earliest Swiss mercenary traditions resemble the Templar model of discipline and loyalty. Certain banking families that rose in the late Middle Ages have records so clean and uninterrupted it is as if their wealth appeared out of nowhere. Legends around Lake Geneva speak of knights in white mantles hiding treasures in mountain caves. Even the famed Swiss Guard, which still protects the Pope today, is sometimes whispered to have inherited more from the Templars than from local militias. Skeptics argue there is no proof, only stories and coincidences. They say Swiss banking grew from trade routes and local independence, not from exiled knights. Yet the coincidences stack higher than the peaks themselves. A vanished order with unmatched financial knowledge, a land built on secrecy and neutrality, and a gap in history where treasure should have been found but never was. Picture the scene: a caravan of knights moving quietly along alpine passes, their carts covered, their banners hidden. Snow crunches beneath hooves, torches flicker against the icy wind, and behind them lies the ruin of France. Ahead of them lies a vault carved by nature itself, a mountain that will guard their secrets for centuries. Maybe the missing Templar fleet did not only sail, maybe part of it climbed. And in those high valleys, a new chapter of their legacy began, silent, hidden, and more enduring than any empire. The northern seas are colder, harsher, filled with winds that bite and waters that churn like iron. Yet in the 14th century, they were also alive with trade. This was the realm of the Hanseatic League, a powerful network of merchant cities stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea. Ships carried furs, amber, timber, and grain across vast distances, their banners flying proudly from ports like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Danzig. It is into this world that some claim the missing Templar fleet slipped, vanishing not into silence but into commerce, hidden behind new sails and new names. The theory is simple but compelling. The Templars were not only warriors and monks, they were businessmen. They understood trade, banking, and shipping better than anyone of their time. If their fleet managed to escape La Rochelle, why would they not seek safety among merchants who prized secrecy and profit above loyalty to kings or popes? The Hanseatic League had the perfect cover. It was vast, decentralized, and already filled with ships moving constantly from port to port. A handful of vessels added to its ranks would disappear like drops of water in the sea. Imagine the sight: Templar ships, their red crosses painted over or their sails replaced, gliding into a Hanseatic harbour at dawn. Dock workers see only another merchant crew unloading barrels of wool or fish. Yet hidden below deck might be chests of relics, scrolls, or coins, stamped with symbols long outlawed in France. With the right bribes and the right promises, the Templars could have bought protection among traders who cared little for papal decrees. There are small but curious pieces of evidence. Some northern chronicles mention mysterious foreign knights passing through Hanseatic ports in the years after 1307. Certain merchant records show sudden surges of unexplained wealth, as if treasure arrived from nowhere. Even the architecture of a few guild halls in northern Germany carries symbols that echo Templar crosses etched faintly into beams or windows. Scholars dismiss these as coincidence, but the legends continue to cling to them. The Baltic itself was a crossroads of power. The Teutonic Knights ruled parts of Prussia, waging holy wars in the east. Some wonder if the Templars joined them, blending their order with another militant brotherhood to survive under a different banner. Others think the fleet simply became merchants in truth, trading openly and building fortunes in silence, waiting for the day their order might be reborn. Skeptics will argue the sea leaves no records, and ships can vanish without ever leaving a clue. Yet the idea that the most skilled sailors and bankers of their time could simply be absorbed into the world's busiest trading network feels strangely fitting. Perhaps they did not need to hide in caves or flee to distant shores. Perhaps they only needed to change their flags. And as the cries of gulls echoed over the harbours of Lübeck and Riga, no one would have guessed that among the barrels and sails moved the last breath of the Templar fleet, cloaked in the language of trade. The ocean stretches endless and dark, a rolling wilderness that swallows ships and stories alike. For centuries, people believed no European had dared to cross it until Columbus in 1492. Yet a more radical tale suggests otherwise. It whispers that the missing Templar fleet, after escaping La Rochelle in 1307, did not vanish into Europe at all. Instead, it sailed west, across the Atlantic, carrying with it not just men and treasure, but the legacy of the order itself. At first, the idea feels impossible. Medieval maps showed only fragments of the known world, and many believed sea monsters and endless falls awaited beyond the horizon. But the Templars were not ordinary sailors. They had travelled across the Mediterranean, mastered long-distance trade, and some say they recovered charts from their time in the Holy Land, maps drawn by older civilizations who knew far more of the earth than history admits. If these whispers are true, then the knights may have possessed knowledge that made such a daring voyage less impossible than it seems. One of the most famous legends ties them to Oak Island in Nova Scotia. For generations, treasure hunters have dug through layers of wood, stone, and strange traps on that small island, convinced something extraordinary lies below. Coconut fibres, carvings of crosses, and tunnels cut deep into the ground suggest planning and engineering beyond local means. Could this have been the hiding place of Templar relics brought across the sea? Some believe so, pointing to similarities between symbols found on the island and those linked to the order. Another thread of the story runs through the Sinclair family of Scotland. Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, is said to have sailed to North America almost 100 years before Columbus. Legends claim he landed in Nova Scotia with a fleet of ships, perhaps even joined by surviving Templars, carrying with them knowledge and symbols that would later echo in Roslin Chapel. Inside that chapel, carved in the mid-15th century, are images of maize and aloe, plants native to the Americas that Europeans should not have known at the time. How could those carvings exist unless someone had already been there and returned with the memory? Skeptics dismiss these ideas as romantic fantasy, but the coincidences refuse to die. Native traditions in parts of Canada and New England speak of strangers arriving by sea long before the Spanish. Stories describe tall men with fair hair and strange clothing, bearing crosses unlike any seen before. Were they Vikings, perhaps? But some argue the descriptions match the Knights of the Temple more closely than raiders from the north. Picture it. A fleet of white-sailed ships moving west into uncharted waters, carrying men who had lost everything in Europe but still clung to their purpose. The waves crash, weeks turn into months, and finally land rises from the mist, forests stretching to the horizon. For the Templars, it would have been a new Jerusalem, a chance to begin again where no king or pope could reach them. Whether myth or truth, the story of the fleet crossing the Atlantic reminds us of something haunting. If they did succeed, then the first Europeans to reach the New World after the Vikings may not have been explorers at all. They may have been fugitives, guardians of secrets, seeking not conquest but survival. For years, kings and commoners alike believed the Templars sat on mountains of wealth, gold stacked in vaults, silver coins spilling from chests, riches gathered from crusades, donations, and banking. When Philip IV struck in October of 1307, he was certain he would seize it all. But when his soldiers broke open the coffers in Paris, there was nothing. No shimmering piles of treasure, no silver bars, not even relics worth pawning. It was as if centuries of accumulation had dissolved into air. So the question rises like a ghost. Could it be that the Templar treasure was never material wealth at all? The order certainly handled enormous sums of money. They loaned to kings, funded crusades, and built fortresses that could withstand armies. But their banking system was unlike anything Europe had seen. Pilgrims deposited wealth in one city and retrieved it in another, protected by secret codes and records. The fortune of the Templars may not have been hidden in a single vault, but scattered across ledgers, investments, and debts owed by those who suddenly had no reason to repay. If the king expected to find gold he could melt down, perhaps he misunderstood that the true treasure was paper, trust, and the invisible lines of credit that only the Templars could control. Yet there are deeper theories. Some say the treasure was never measured in coins, but in relics carried back from Jerusalem, holy artifacts looted or preserved from the Temple Mount. Others believe the order had uncovered ancient texts, maps, or knowledge that could challenge the church itself. In that sense, the treasure was not meant to enrich, but to empower, something that could give the Templars influence beyond any throne, perhaps even beyond time. Imagine the shock of Philip's men searching the Paris temple. They expected gold heavy enough to bend their backs, but instead they found ashes in the fireplaces, empty rooms, and silence. To them, it looked like nothing. To the Templars, it may have meant everything. A void carefully prepared so no hand but theirs would ever hold the truth. What if the knights knew that true power did not lie in metal, but in memory, not in silver, but in secrecy? The absence itself feels intentional, a performance, a statement. It said to kings and popes alike, "You can shatter our bodies, but you will never hold what we guard." That is why the story endures. Because gold and silver can vanish, can be melted, stolen, spent. But an idea, a secret, a lineage, those cannot be seized by soldiers. So perhaps the Templar treasure was never lost at all. Perhaps it was never treasure in the way we imagine. Instead, it was something far more valuable. Knowledge disguised as myth, faith hidden in symbols, power encrypted in silence. And if that is true, then the empty vaults of 1307 are not a mystery. They are a message. One that still echoes through history, whispering that the greatest wealth is not what glitters, but what endures unseen. The Templars were not just warriors and bankers, they were guardians. From the moment they established themselves in Jerusalem in the early 12th century, their legend grew around whispers that they had discovered something buried beneath the ruins of the Temple Mount. For 9 years, they dug in secret tunnels, away from the eyes of the city, and when they emerged, they were no longer a handful of poor knights. They were powerful, respected, and untouchable. Many believe it was not coin that elevated them, but relics, sacred objects tied to the very heart of Christianity, treasures that carried weight far beyond gold. Centuries later, when their order was broken in 1307, rumours followed their missing fleet. People said the ships of La Rochelle carried more than men and supplies. They carried fragments of the true cross, splinters of the wood on which Christ had been crucified, relics that inspired armies and crowned emperors. Others swore the knights had preserved the Holy Grail itself, not as a golden cup, but as a relic of bloodline and belief, an object that defined divine authority. And then there is the most audacious claim of all, that the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest said to hold the tablets of Moses, passed into Templar hands and was spirited away into exile. Imagine what it would have meant if these relics truly were aboard those ships. To kings, they were symbols of legitimacy. To the church, they were proof of divine connection. To the people, they were the holiest objects ever known. Whoever possessed them would not just wield wealth, but claim power over hearts and faith itself. That is why these rumours burn so brightly. Because the absence of treasure can be explained, but the silence around relics feels heavier. There are echoes across Europe, that keep the story alive. Churches in Spain and Portugal claim to hold Templar relics, their origins never fully explained. In Ethiopia, legends persist that knights once carried a golden chest through its highlands, guarding it with their lives. In southern France, shrines tied to the Magdalene cult hint that relics connected to her were protected by the order. These stories do not prove anything, yet together they paint a picture of men burdened with objects too powerful to reveal. Skeptics argue it is all myth. They say the Templars never found more than coins and bones, that the Ark and the Grail belong to scripture and legend, not history. But why then did the Templars inspire such fear in kings and popes? Why did Philip and Clement move with such urgency to erase them? Perhaps because the knights held something that could not be controlled. Picture a darkened ship's hold, waves crashing above, and in the shadows a chest bound in iron. Inside, not gold, but a fragment of wood, a vessel, or a scroll that could change the story of the world. If those relics truly sailed west, then they remain hidden still, their guardianship passed from hand to hand, their presence lingering just beyond the reach of history. And perhaps that is why the mystery of the Templars is never silenced. Because relics, once touched by the divine, are never just objects. They are keys, and the question is, to what door? The Grail is a story that has haunted Europe for centuries. To some, it is a golden cup used at the Last Supper. To others, it is a vessel that caught the blood of Christ at the crucifixion. But for many who follow the trail of the Templars, the Grail is not an object at all. It is a bloodline, the belief that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had children, that their descendants survived, and that the Knights of the Temple became their protectors. When the fleet vanished from La Rochelle in 1307, whispers began to fuse the two mysteries together. The lost ships, the hidden treasure, and the Grail itself became inseparable in legend. The connection is not accidental. From the 12th century onward, stories of the Grail rose in popularity across Europe, told in poems and romances that seemed oddly tied to the time when the Templars were strongest. Writers like Chrétien de Troyes described knights on quests to guard or recover the Grail, often under mysterious vows of secrecy. Some of these tales emerged from the very regions where the Templars held power. It is as if myth and history bled into each other, and the Knights of the Temple became the living embodiment of those legends. By the time the Order was destroyed, the Grail was no longer just a tale of chivalry. It was whispered to be the very reason for their persecution. If the Templars protected a bloodline that threatened the authority of both crown and church, then Philip IV and Pope Clement had every reason to erase them. This explains why the fleet's disappearance is not just about treasure, it is about survival, not of coins or relics, but of people. A lineage hidden across oceans and generations, its guardians always one step ahead of those who would destroy it. Evidence is scarce, but symbols remain. In southern France, where both the Templars and the Magdalene cult were strong, churches were dedicated to Mary Magdalene long before Rome allowed her veneration. In Roslin Chapel in Scotland, carvings depict roses, stars, and cryptic patterns that many interpret as nods to a sacred family. Even in Templar seals, some historians see hidden references to duality, fertility, and continuity, subtle hints that their true task was not guarding Holy Land, but holy blood. Critics call this fantasy, a modern invention popularized by novels and conspiracy theories. Yet the persistence of the story is hard to ignore. Why does the Grail appear again and again in connection with the Templars? Why did their fleet vanish so completely, leaving no trace of men, treasure, or destination? Perhaps because what they carried could not be catalogued, stolen, or displayed. A living Grail, a bloodline that had to remain hidden until the world was ready to understand. Picture the fleet sailing west under a moonlit sky. In the captain's cabin, not a jeweled chalice, but a mother and child, or scrolls charting a genealogy guarded for centuries. The ships carried not wealth, but legacy, not relics, but heirs. If the Grail is blood, then it still flows somewhere in the world today, hidden like the fleet itself, waiting to be found, not in stone or gold, but in the veins of the forgotten. There is a theory that the Templars did not guard gold or relics at all, but something far more dangerous: knowledge. From the moment they settled on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem in the early 12th century, people have whispered about what they uncovered beneath its ruins. For 9 years, the Knights dug through ancient tunnels, and when they emerged, their fortunes and influence rose almost overnight. What if what they carried away from that place was not treasure, but scrolls, maps, or texts filled with truths that the Church would never allow to surface? Knowledge in the Middle Ages was power. Books were rare, guarded by monasteries, and often chained to desks to keep them from being stolen. But the Templars had access to lands, languages, and libraries far beyond Europe. They walked the streets of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Acre, cities layered with centuries of forgotten empires. They spoke with Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians, and through them they may have collected wisdom erased in the West. Texts on medicine, mathematics, astronomy, or even theology that challenged the rigid control of Rome. Such knowledge would have made the Knights invaluable, but also dangerous. When the order was crushed in 1307, the king's men and the Pope's inquisitors searched for treasure. What they may have truly feared was the spread of forbidden ideas. Imagine scrolls that claimed Christ's life was different from the official story, maps that revealed the world was larger than anyone admitted, or documents that connected Christianity to older faiths in ways the Church could not explain. To hold such records would be to hold a weapon sharper than any sword. It would undermine the very foundations of authority. This is why some believe the missing fleet carried not riches but archives, locked chests filled with manuscripts written in Hebrew, Greek, or Arabic, charts of stars and seas that could guide ships far across oceans, books of secrets older than Europe itself. If such things were aboard, it would explain why the Knights burned documents in Paris as the soldiers closed in. They were erasing traces, buying time for their most precious cargo to escape. The echoes of this theory linger. In Portugal, the Order of Christ became leaders of exploration, their ships sailing further than any before them. Did they succeed because they inherited maps hidden away by the Templars? In Switzerland, banking families rose suddenly with sophisticated systems that mirrored Templar methods. Did they inherit not coins, but records? Even Rochelle Chapel in Scotland is said to hide carved codes that resemble ancient alphabets, as though fragments of lost writings survived in stone. Skeptics argue there is no proof, but that is exactly the point. Knowledge this dangerous would not be left lying around. It would be hidden, encrypted, disguised, passed down in whispers or secret rituals. So perhaps the real Templar treasure was not gold or relics at all. Perhaps it was a library, one carried across seas and mountains, one that still waits in silence because some truths are too heavy for kings or popes to carry, but perfect for a fleet that wanted to vanish forever. What if the Templars were not protecting treasure at all? What if the fleet that slipped away from La Rochelle in October of 1307 was not carrying gold, silver, or relics, but something alive? This is the heart of the custodianship theory, the idea that the Knights were safeguarding people. Some say it was descendants of a sacred bloodline, perhaps tied to the Grail legend. Others believe it was initiates, men and women carrying secret teachings that had to be preserved at any cost. Whatever the truth, the suggestion is that the missing fleet was less an escape and more an escort. Consider the timing. Philip IV had grown desperate, his debts to the Templars crushing his crown. Pope Clement, caught between fear and obligation, agreed to sanction the arrests. The plan was brutal and total. Strike on the same night, across the same kingdom, and erase the order from history. If the Templars had warning, even just a few days, they would have known their vaults were vulnerable. They may have accepted that gold could be lost, but blood and knowledge could not. And so, the fleet became an ark, a vessel not of treasure, but of survival. Legends in France and Scotland whisper of mysterious arrivals during those years. Families of noble but uncertain origin who seem to appear from nowhere, carrying strange seals and claiming ancient rights. In Portugal, the reborn Order of Christ soon possessed not just land, but traditions and initiates who seemed already trained in the ways of the temple. It is possible that these individuals were the cargo of the fleet, men and women quietly placed where they could carry forward the Order's mission without ever revealing themselves. The custodianship theory also ties into the Grail connection. If the Templars believed they were protecting a bloodline, then their priority would not be relics or coins. It would be ensuring that certain people were never captured. Imagine a small group of ships carrying families, children, or chosen guardians, whisked away under the cover of night, their names erased but their legacy preserved. The knights on deck were not just sailors, but protectors of a living secret. Skeptics argue there is no evidence, no names, no documents. Yet perhaps that is the greatest proof of all. If the Templars succeeded in hiding people, those people would have blended seamlessly into history. They would not appear in chronicles, because their very survival depended on being invisible. What lingers instead are symbols, traditions, and sudden bursts of unexplained influence in regions where the Templars were supposedly destroyed. Picture it, a fleet cutting through black waters, torches flickering on the shore behind them, Paris already turning against them. In the holds below deck, not gold but voices, families huddled in silence, the true legacy of the temple hidden beneath sails. If this theory is right, then the Templars did not lose everything in 1307. They simply shifted their guardianship from relics to flesh, from treasure to blood. And somewhere in the centuries that followed, their charge may still be walking quietly through history, protected not by walls or crowns, but by secrecy itself. In a dusty archive in France lies a curious chart, drawn in the 16th century, but hinting at something far older. It shows the familiar outlines of Europe, the twisting coasts of France, Spain, and Portugal, and the open sweep of the Atlantic. What makes it strange are the routes inked from the port of La Rochelle. They do not follow the well-trodden paths to England or down toward Iberia. Instead, they strike west, bold lines cutting into the emptiness of the ocean centuries before Columbus set sail. Scholars who have studied the map call it an oddity, an anachronism, perhaps even a forgery. Yet the question remains, why would anyone in the 16th century draw routes from La Rochelle that seem to predate the Age of Discovery? To those who know the story of the missing Templar fleet, the answer is haunting. La Rochelle was the last stronghold of the Knights at sea. It was from this harbour that their ships supposedly vanished in October of 1307, slipping away in the night before Philip's men could seize them. If those vessels carried knowledge of secret passages across the Atlantic, then the strange chart may not be fantasy at all. It may be a trace of memory, copied and recopied across generations until it reached the 16th century, long after its creators were gone. The chart itself is puzzling. The lines are not labelled with destinations, but their angles and distances roughly match later transatlantic routes to the Americas. One path bends southwest, as if skirting the Azores before heading into deeper water. Another strikes almost directly west, toward lands that should not have existed in European eyes until Columbus's voyage in 1492. And yet here they are, marked centuries earlier, drawn from the very port where the Templar fleet disappeared. How could such knowledge exist? One possibility is that the Templars inherited maps during their time in the Holy Land. Ancient civilizations may have charted more of the world than history admits, and those charts could have passed through Arab traders or Jewish scholars into the hands of the Order. Another possibility is that the fleet itself ventured west, and those who survived left behind fragments of their journey. Over time, the memory became distorted, resurfacing in the form of the strange chart. Skeptics argue it could be nothing more than a cartographer's imagination, lines sketched for practice or decoration. But the fact that the routes begin at La Rochelle of all places, makes the coincidence difficult to ignore. Why not Lisbon or Seville, the great ports of exploration? Why the very harbour tied to the Templar mystery? Imagine a knight centuries removed from the fall of the Order, sitting at a desk lit by candlelight, drawing from inherited knowledge passed down in whispers and secret archives. He cannot write the truth openly, so he buries it in a chart, a line from La Rochelle into the unknown, a silent clue to a voyage that official history has erased. If the map is genuine, it suggests that the missing fleet may not have been lost at all. They may have left their trail on the sea, written in ink, waiting for someone centuries later to notice that the westward path was already known. Roslin Chapel stands in the green hills of Scotland, its stone walls rising like a puzzle carved in silence. Built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, it is famous not just for its beauty, but for its mysteries. Every surface seems alive with symbols. Angels with musical instruments, knights with swords, and strange patterns twisting into spirals. But among all these carvings are two that should not exist. One shows maize, the tall corn plant native to the Americas. Another depicts aloe, also unknown in Europe, until after Columbus returned from the New World in 1493. And yet, these carvings were cut decades earlier, long before anyone in Europe was supposed to know such plants existed. The question is obvious. How could maize and aloe appear in a Scottish chapel before the voyages of Columbus? To many, the answer lies with the Templars. The Sinclair family, who built Roslin, had long been linked to legends of knights who carried secrets across oceans. Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, is said to have sailed west in 1398, nearly a century before Columbus. Some claim he reached Nova Scotia, guided by Norse sailors, and perhaps joined by surviving Templars who had vanished from La Rochelle. If this legend holds truth, then Roslin Chapel may be more than a church. It may be a stone memory of voyages long forgotten. Imagine masons carving what they had been told by travellers. They shape the likeness of a plant unknown in Europe, described as tall and fruitful, with kernels that feed entire villages. They carve aloe with its long spiked leaves, a plant known for healing, brought back in memory from across the sea. These carvings are not mistakes. They are precise and unmistakable, and they should not exist where they do, unless someone had already seen those plants. Roslin is soaked in Templar imagery. Its architecture echoes the sacred geometry of the Temple Mount. Its symbols speak of hidden knowledge, duality, and the guardianship of something precious. To walk its aisles is to feel the weight of secrets that were never written but carved into stone for those who could read them. The maize and aloe are part of that code, a silent claim that the world was wider than the church allowed, and that the fleet of the temple may have sailed further than history admits. Skeptics argue that the carvings are misinterpreted, that the supposed maize could be wheat or some other plant, but when placed side by side, the resemblance is too close to dismiss. The chapel's masons captured details that suggest direct knowledge, not guesses. And when combined with the Sinclair voyage legend, the carvings transform from curiosities into evidence. Stand in Roslin Chapel and look closely. The light filters through stained glass, dust drifts through the air, and hidden among angels and saints, the shapes of New World plants wait in silence. They tell a story not of Columbus, but of earlier sails, of knights who vanished into the Atlantic and returned with memories carved forever into stone. If the Templar fleet reached the Americas, Roslin Chapel may be the proof left behind, standing quietly in Scotland, whispering across centuries. Oak Island sits off the coast of Nova Scotia, a small patch of land surrounded by cold Atlantic waters. From a distance, it looks ordinary, with trees and marshes and rocky shores. But beneath its soil lies one of the most enduring mysteries of the last 2 centuries. Stories of hidden tunnels, booby traps, and treasure buried deep underground have drawn treasure hunters to its shores since the late 18th century. Some believe Spanish gold was hidden there, others blame pirates. But for many, the most tantalizing theory is that Oak Island hides the lost treasure of the Knights Templar, brought across the Atlantic by the missing fleet that vanished from La Rochelle in 1307. The story begins in 1795, when a young man named Daniel McGuinness noticed a strange depression in the ground on Oak Island. He and his friends dug into it and discovered layers of wooden platforms buried every 10 feet, as if someone had carefully constructed a shaft and then sealed it. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. More wood, more signs of engineering, and eventually floods of water that seemed to pour in from hidden tunnels connected to the sea. Over the years, countless groups tried to reach the bottom of what became known as the Money Pit. Each attempt ended in disaster. The tunnels refilled with water, collapses occurred, and men lost their lives chasing the mystery. What makes the Templar connection so compelling are the clues found along the way. Inscriptions carved into stones were uncovered, some of them resembling codes linked to the order. Coconut fibres were discovered deep underground, a material not native to Nova Scotia, but often used on ships, suggesting cargo was carefully packed and buried. Some hunters even claim to find small crosses and symbols matching Templar seals. None of it has been definitive, yet the pattern suggests more than pirates hiding stolen loot. It suggests planning, precision, and secrecy on a scale far beyond common thieves. The theory goes that the fleet sailed west, carrying not only men but their most precious treasures. Oak Island, secluded and defensible, became the perfect hiding place. The tunnels and traps were not to protect gold from casual looters, but to ensure that only those who knew the code, perhaps members of a surviving order, could ever retrieve what was hidden. The treasure, if it exists, may not even be coins or jewels. It could be relics, scrolls, or proof of the very secrets the Templars were accused of guarding. Skeptics argue it is all coincidence, that eager imaginations have twisted pirate stories into Templar myths. But then why the elaborate engineering? Why the deadly traps? Why the relentless obsession that continues to this day? Oak Island resists every attempt to give up its secret, as if it was designed to do so. Stand on its shores and look at the restless Atlantic, and it is easy to imagine white-sailed ships slipping into the bay centuries ago, their cargo lowered into shafts and sealed with stone. If so, the island is not just a mystery. It is a graveyard of secrets, holding what may be the last great legacy of the missing Templar fleet. The story of the missing Templar fleet often drifts north to the windswept islands of Orkney and to a family whose name has become inseparable from the legend. The Sinclairs were powerful lords in medieval Scotland, rulers of Orkney and protectors of the northern seas. More importantly, they were known to be allies of the Templars, offering support even after the order was declared heretical. This bond has led many to wonder if the fleet that slipped away from La Rochelle in 1307 found its way not just to Scotland, but to the Sinclairs themselves. The strongest link in this chain is Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, who lived in the late 14th century. His name surfaces in one of the boldest legends of the North Atlantic, the claim that he sailed to America nearly a century before Columbus. According to accounts preserved in Norse and Scottish traditions, Henry commanded a voyage in 1398, reaching the shores of Nova Scotia. There he and his men supposedly encountered native peoples and explored lands that no other European would officially claim until long after his time. Some even believe Henry built settlements, leaving behind structures and symbols that later inspired the Oak Island mystery. If this legend holds even a trace of truth, then the question becomes simple. Where did Henry Sinclair learn to cross the Atlantic? Navigating such distances required maps, knowledge of currents, and courage beyond what most medieval sailors possessed, and that is where the Templars return to the story. Some researchers argue that the fleet, fleeing persecution a century earlier, may have sought shelter under Sinclair protection. In exchange, They could have shared charts, relics, or even men who had already made the voyage. The Sinclairs were Masonic patrons and builders of Rochelle Chapel, a structure filled with carvings that hint at voyages to the New World. Maize and aloe, both plants native to the Americas, appear in its stone decades before Europeans supposedly saw them. Was this a coincidence, or a hidden nod to what Henry or his ancestors had already witnessed? Skeptics dismiss the idea as romantic fiction, pointing out the lack of hard evidence for Henry Sinclair's voyage. But oral traditions in Orkney and Nova Scotia have carried the tale for centuries, too detailed and too persistent to be ignored entirely. Add to this the Sinclair family's close ties to the Templars, and the picture becomes harder to dismiss. They were wealthy, independent, and rebellious, the perfect hosts for an outlawed order looking for allies. Imagine the northern seas in the early 14th century, fog rolling across the waves as white-sailed ships appear on the horizon. They dock quietly in Orkney, their crews weary but determined, their cargo hidden beneath decks. On the shore, the Sinclairs welcome them, not as fugitives, but as brothers. From that moment, the legacy of the fleet may have fused with the destiny of the Sinclairs, producing legends that reached across the ocean. Whether the story is history or myth, the name Sinclair has become forever linked to the missing Templar fleet, and the possibility that its secret lived on in stone, blood, and voyages that reshaped the world before the world was ready. When the age of discovery exploded in the 15th century, one nation stood at its centre, Portugal. From the rugged coast of Lisbon, ships sailed into waters no one else dared to cross. They rounded Africa, reached India, touched Brazil, and carved a maritime empire that stretched across the world. The question is, how did this small kingdom leap so far ahead while greater powers, like France and England, lagged behind? Some say the answer lies in the shadows of the Templars, in maps and knowledge carried by the missing fleet and preserved by the Order of Christ. After the suppression of the Templars in 1307, Portugal did something no other kingdom dared. King Dinis protected the knights, refusing to destroy them. Instead, he transformed them into the Order of Christ, a new name that satisfied the Pope while preserving their lands, castles, and traditions. In Tomar, the Templar stronghold became the headquarters of this reborn order. From there, rituals continued, symbols survived, and perhaps most importantly, knowledge endured. By the time Prince Henry the Navigator rose to power in the 15th century, Portugal already possessed an edge. Henry himself was Grand Master of the Order of Christ, and under his patronage, fleets began sailing further than ever before. His captains carried sails marked with the same red cross once borne by knights in Jerusalem. It was as if the Templar fleet had been reborn as a fleet of exploration, not armed with swords, but with compasses and stars. Theories suggest the Templars had acquired maps during their years in the East. Ancient charts showing coasts and currents unknown to Europe, knowledge from Arab navigators, Jewish scholars, or perhaps even from civilizations much older, passed into the Order's hands beneath the Temple Mount. When the fleet vanished from La Rochelle, some believe those maps were among the treasures carried away. If they reached Portugal, they would have been preserved by the Order of Christ and later used to guide voyages into the Atlantic and beyond. This may explain why Portugal seemed to know where to sail. The Azores, Madeira, and the Cape Verde Islands were discovered with uncanny precision, as though explorers had hints of their existence long before they appeared on the horizon. Later, Vasco da Gama reached India by a route that had seemed impossible, and Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed in Brazil, almost as if he had been looking for it. Too much coincidence surrounds their success. For some to believe it was luck alone, skeptics argue that Portugal's rise came from determination, investment, and skilled sailors. And yes, those played their part. But the sudden leap, centuries ahead of rivals, leaves a question unanswered. Did they start with a map no one else had, stand inside the fortress of Tomar, where carvings of ships and stars line the walls, and the red cross of the order still burns in stained glass. It feels less like coincidence and more like continuity. Perhaps the missing Templar fleet never vanished. Perhaps it simply changed its sails and carried its knowledge into a new age, guiding Portugal into the future with secrets no king of France would ever touch. The skull and crossbones is one of the most recognizable symbols in history. It flies on pirate flags, etched into legends of buried treasure and lawless seas. But what if its roots stretch back not to pirates at all, but to the Knights Templar? Some researchers argue that the Jolly Roger, the black banner of death, is a descendant of imagery once used by the Order, carried across oceans by survivors of the missing fleet after 1307. If true, then the very symbol of piracy may in fact be the ghost of the temple. The Templars were no strangers to the skull. In their rituals, bones were reminders of mortality, symbols that life was fleeting and service to God eternal. Some seals and carvings show skulls paired with crossed femurs, the same design later carried on pirate flags. One legend claims that a Templar knight named Hugues de Payens was buried with his skull and bones arranged separately, inspiring the order to adopt it as a memento mori. To the Templars, it was never about piracy, but about faith, death, and resurrection. Yet symbols have a way of surviving, even when their meanings change. When the fleet vanished from La Rochelle, its men became fugitives with nowhere to turn. Stripped of legitimacy, hunted by kings, they may have turned to the only profession left to skilled sailors and warriors: privateering. The seas of the 14th and 15th centuries were filled with mercenary crews who sold their swords to whoever would pay. The Templar fleet, armed, disciplined, and desperate, could have easily shifted into this role. And with them, their symbols may have followed, the skull and bones reappearing not as a holy reminder, but as a banner of fear. Pirates were not random raiders. Many were former privateers, men once commissioned by crowns who later turned outlaw. If Templar survivors had blended into these ranks, their discipline and secrecy could have shaped early piracy. The Jolly Roger, then, would not just be a warning of death, but a hidden signature of a lost brotherhood. Even the name Roger itself has been linked by some to the term Roge Signum, Latin for red sign, echoing the red cross of the temple. There are stories of early pirate crews showing strange respect for churches and monasteries, sparing them even as they plundered towns. There are tales of coded rituals among captains, of secret councils where decisions were made not by tyranny but by vote, echoing the Templar chapter meetings. These fragments suggest that behind the chaos of piracy may have lingered traces of order, remnants of men trained under the temple. Skeptics argue it is coincidence that the skull is too common a symbol to be tied directly to the Templars. But the timing is suggestive. The image first begins to appear on the seas, not long after the disappearance of the fleet. And what better disguise for a vanished order than to cloak themselves in the identity of outlaws, feared by all, controlled by none? Picture it. A ship glides across dark waters, its sails black, its banner snapping in the wind. On it, the skull and crossbones stare like a death mask, striking terror into every heart. To the world, it is piracy. To those who remember, it may be something else entirely. A sign that the Templars never vanished, they simply changed their flag. When the Templars were arrested in October of 1307, the world waited for the announcement that their treasure had been seized, yet none ever came. The papacy, which had long claimed to be the guardian of faith and truth, offered no explanation for the missing wealth of the most powerful order in Christendom. Pope Clement V, who had sanctioned the arrests under pressure from King Philip IV of France, wrote of trials, confessions, and heresies, but never of gold, relics, or maps. This silence is one of the most puzzling parts of the story. Why did the Church say nothing? One possibility is ignorance. Perhaps the Templars were so skilled at hiding their assets that even the papacy could not find them. The Order's banking system was advanced, spread across continents, and secured with codes no outsider could easily crack. If the fleet had already vanished with its cargo, then Clement may have had nothing to reveal. Admitting that the treasure was gone would have only deepened suspicion that the Church was powerless against the knights it had just condemned. Another possibility is complicity. The papacy may have known exactly where the treasure went and chosen to remain silent. The Church was deeply entangled with the Templars. Popes had relied on their loans, their armies, and their protection. To acknowledge that the knights carried away forbidden relics or knowledge would have meant admitting that Rome had lost control of something sacred. It may have been easier to say nothing, to let the fleet fade into rumour, while carefully avoiding questions that could not be answered without shaking the foundations of authority. There is also the possibility of fear. The Templars had been accused of heresy, of secret rites, and hidden truths that challenged the Church itself. What if those accusations were not entirely false? If the Order had preserved scrolls or relics that could undermine the story of Christ or the authority of the papacy, Clement would have had every reason to bury the matter in silence. To speak of missing treasures would have been to invite questions about their nature. Were they coins, or were they gospels, gold or bloodline? The less said, the safer the throne of Peter remained. What makes the silence even stranger is that the papacy has never lifted it. Later records speak of confiscations and trials, but not of a grand recovery of wealth. No celebration of a captured hoard, no display of relics in Rome. Instead, there is only a void, filled by whispers of fleets, secret orders, and hidden vaults. In the history of the Church, which documents miracles and martyrdoms in great detail, this absence feels deliberate. Picture the Vatican in the early 14th century. Scrolls and reports arrive from France, detailing the arrests and the burning of knights. Yet, in the quiet corners of the archives, another truth may have been recorded and sealed away, not destroyed, not confessed, but hidden. Perhaps the papacy was not blind at all, but chose to close its eyes, and that silence, more than any accusation, is what keeps the mystery of the missing Templar treasure alive. When the Templar fleet slipped from La Rochelle in 1307, it seemed to vanish into the fog of history, but some believe it did not disappear at all. Instead, the Order transformed. No longer able to exist openly as knights sworn to a pope who had betrayed them, they may have gone underground, carrying with them not just relics and wealth, but ideas. Over the centuries, whispers trace their survival through new names and symbols. Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and other secret societies are often accused of being the descendants of the lost fleet, heirs to a tradition that refused to die. The Rosicrucians first appeared in the 17th century, describing themselves as keepers of secret wisdom. They claimed to possess hidden knowledge of alchemy, medicine, and divine truth, revealed only to those ready to receive it. Their mysterious manifestos spoke of a fraternity bound by secrecy and marked by strange symbols of roses and crosses. To many, this felt like an echo of the Templars, who had once been accused of guarding forbidden knowledge from the East. The timing, the secrecy, and the themes suggest more than coincidence. The Freemasons are an even stronger candidate. Their lodges, rituals, and symbols often trace back to architecture and sacred geometry, concepts deeply tied to the Templars, who built fortresses and churches across Europe. The twin pillars, the compass and square, the emphasis on moral brotherhood, all hint at continuity from something older. In Scotland, where the Templars were said to have found refuge, early Masonic records appear in the 15th century. Just as Roslin Chapel was being filled with carvings that mix Christian iconography with symbols outsiders still struggle to decode, many believe the Sinclairs, builders of Roslin, acted as guardians of the Templar legacy, embedding it in stone while passing the rest into the lodges of the Freemasons. The idea that secret societies are descendants of the fleet may sound like conspiracy, yet it explains why their traditions emphasize hidden truths. What if their rituals are not inventions, but reenactments of older vows? What if their symbols are not abstractions, but codes meant to preserve the memory of the order? From bees and roses to stars and crosses, these marks appear again and again across groups centuries apart. Critics dismiss this as myth-making, claiming that Freemasonry grew from medieval guilds and Rosicrucianism from early modern mysticism. But the connections are too striking for many to ignore. The persistence of Templar themes in organizations that appear long after the order's fall suggests a line of inheritance, subtle but deliberate. The fleet may not have survived as a navy, but as a brotherhood, reshaping itself to survive in a world that hunted its name. Picture it, a Templar knight stripped of his white mantle, stepping into a hidden hall lit by candles. He passes on the vows of secrecy, the signs of recognition, the symbols carved into memory. Centuries later, men in aprons and sashes repeat the same gestures, unaware or half-aware that their roots lie in ships that fled La Rochelle. If the theory holds, then the fleet never vanished. It became the seed of societies that still meet in silence today, carrying fragments of a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Beneath the streets of Rome lies a labyrinth of shelves, vaults, and locked chambers known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries, it was called the Vatican's Secret Archive, not because of scandal, but from the Latin word secretum, meaning private. Yet the name fits all too well. Within its walls are miles of documents, papal bulls, trial records, letters, and maps, stretching back more than 1,000 years. Scholars allowed inside describe endless rows of shelves and doors that lead to locked rooms they cannot enter. And among those hidden stacks, some believe, lie the missing references to the Templar fleet, deliberately omitted from the history shown to the world. The Vatican was deeply involved in the downfall of the order. Pope Clement V, pressured by King Philip of France, sanctioned the arrests in October of 1307. Trial records were written, confessions coerced, and judgments sealed. Yet nowhere in the surviving public documents is there mention of the missing treasure or the vanished ships. This absence feels deliberate. The papacy, which recorded everything from the excommunication of kings to the number of relics on display in tiny churches, suddenly has nothing to say about one of the greatest mysteries of the age. Some researchers suggest that the references were never destroyed, only hidden. Papal scribes may have written reports about what happened at La Rochelle, about what treasures or people were carried away, but those reports may have been locked in sections of the archive never opened to the public. Only a handful of scholars are granted limited access each year, and their requests must be specific. You cannot simply walk in and ask to see everything about the Templars. You are guided, watched, and restricted, your hands only touching what the Vatican allows. This system makes it all too easy for certain subjects to disappear into silence. There have been curious hints. In the 19th century, a few researchers claimed to see references in papal correspondence to shipments moved out of France during the arrests. The details were vague, but they suggested that church officials knew more than they admitted. Later, those same letters were catalogued differently, as if to bury the trail in a sea of unrelated documents. Some scholars believe the Vatican's refusal to release all Templar materials is not about preserving fragile manuscripts, but about protecting a secret too destabilizing to reveal. Imagine what might lie inside those locked chambers. A map marked with routes westward, letters between Clement and his bishops discussing the ships at La Rochelle, or even inventories of objects that vanished from the temple vaults before the king's soldiers arrived. If such records exist, they would explain why the fleet has remained a mystery. The truth was not erased. It was filed away, accessible only to those who already know what it says. The silence of the Vatican is louder than denial. By never acknowledging the fleet, it allows the mystery to breathe, leaving the world to wonder. Perhaps that is the intention. Some truths, once spoken, cannot be controlled, and so they remain locked in the dark, waiting for a key the Church may never allow the world to hold. From the moment the Templar fleet vanished from La Rochelle, the world has been chasing stories of treasure. Gold hidden beneath islands, relics locked in mountains, maps carved into stone. But what if those stories were never meant to lead to answers? What if they were smoke screens, planted to mislead anyone who searched too closely? The disinformation campaign theory suggests that the very legends we follow may have been created by the Templars themselves or by their enemies, designed to protect the truth by burying it in noise. Consider how fast the treasure stories appeared. Within years of the arrests in 1307, rumours spread across Europe about missing hoards and ships sailing into the night. Yet no one could prove them. This chaos of speculation may have been exactly what the Templars wanted. If they carried something far more dangerous than gold, perhaps a relic or forbidden knowledge, then letting the world chase after coins and jewels would keep attention safely diverted. Hunters would dig into the ground, looking for chests, while the real secret remained hidden in plain sight. It is also possible that the Crown and papacy encouraged these distractions. King Philip had every reason to spread stories of vanished gold. It justified his attack on the order, making the knights seem guilty of theft. Pope Clement, eager to deflect attention from what the Church might have gained or lost, could have allowed the same rumours to spread unchecked. By turning the fleet into a myth of treasure, both king and pope avoided harder questions. Questions about why the order was destroyed so suddenly, and what it was they truly carried. The darker possibility is that there was no treasure at all, that the Templars, despite their power, were already drained by years of war and defeat in the Holy Land. Their fleet may have carried nothing more than men, supplies, or even empty holds. If so, the stories of relics, grails, and lost knowledge would be clever illusions to disguise the Order's collapse. Admitting they had nothing would have destroyed their mystique. Spinning legends of wealth and secrets kept their memory alive, and their enemies guessing. But then again, absence itself can be telling. If the fleet had been meaningless, why did the authorities never release proof? Why the silence from the papacy? Why the persistent legends across France, Scotland, Portugal, and beyond? A simple lie does not echo for centuries unless it hides a grain of truth. Perhaps the disinformation was not to cover emptiness, but to mask something heavier, a bloodline, a gospel, a secret that could not be allowed to surface. Picture a council of knights in the final days before the arrests. They know their order will fall. They know their fleet will sail. And they decide to let the world chase shadows. They whisper of gold in islands, relics in vaults, maps in chapels, knowing that centuries later treasure hunters will still be digging in the dirt. Meanwhile, the real legacy of the fleet sails on, untouched, unspoken, and shielded by a fog of stories too thick to see through. That may be the Templars' greatest victory, not hiding treasure, but hiding truth behind endless distraction. In June of 1314, Scotland faced one of its darkest hours. Edward II of England marched north with a massive army, determined to crush Robert the Bruce and end Scottish independence once and for all. The two sides clashed at Bannockburn, a battle that has since become legend. Against overwhelming odds, Bruce's smaller force triumphed, sending the English army into retreat and securing Scotland's freedom. Historians attribute the victory to clever tactics and the fierce will of the Scots. But legends whisper of another hand at play, the missing Templar fleet. 7 years earlier, the Templars had been destroyed across Europe, yet in Scotland things were different. The Pope's authority held little sway over Robert the Bruce, who himself had been excommunicated. Scotland was already cut off from Rome, making it the perfect refuge for outlaws of faith. If ships from La Rochelle had sailed north in 1307, Bannockburn may have been where they revealed their loyalty. The story tells of a mysterious band of heavily armed horsemen who rode into the field at a critical moment, turning the tide of the fight. To some, they were Highland reinforcements. To others, they were something far older, Eyewitness accounts are scarce, but later traditions describe mounted knights charging under unfamiliar banners, cutting into English lines with sudden force. Their discipline, armour, and sheer presence were unlike anything the Scots expected. For those who see the Templar shadow, this was the moment when the exiled order repaid Scotland for sheltering them. The fleet had not only escaped but found purpose, lending their swords to a king who defied both England and Rome. It is tempting to dismiss the story as myth, but Robert the Bruce's sudden resurgence after years of struggle is striking. He had been hunted, his family captured, his kingdom broken. Yet at Bannockburn, he not only survived, but crushed a far larger army. Could fate alone explain such a reversal? Or did the presence of battle-hardened knights, veterans of crusades, shift the balance? The Templars, if they truly stood with Bruce, would have brought not just skill in combat, but also strategies honed across decades of warfare in the East. The victory at Bannockburn carried consequences far beyond Scotland. It signalled that the authority of kings and popes was not absolute. It showed that outlawed orders and exiled warriors could still tip the scales of history. If the Templars were there, they may not have sought glory or recognition. They may have fought in silence, their identities hidden, their survival still a secret. Their reward was not honour but continuity, the chance to live another day and carry their legacy forward. Stand on the battlefield today, and the air still hums with memory. The grass sways over ground once soaked in blood. Monuments rise to Bruce and his men, and yet the whispers remain. That in the chaos of Bannockburn, white mantles once again rode into battle, not for Jerusalem, but for survival. If true, then the Templar fleet did not vanish into myth. It became part of Scotland's greatest victory, a hidden hand shaping the destiny of a nation. When the Templars were crushed in 1307, it seemed the order had been erased from history. But in Portugal, things unfolded differently. King Dinis, shrewd and defiant, refused to destroy the knights. Instead, he transformed them into something new. In 1312, with papal approval, the Order of Christ was born. It carried a different name, but the same men, the same lands, and likely the same secrets. From its fortress at Tomar, the order endured, hidden in plain sight. And centuries later, its red cross would fly again, not on crusades in the Holy Land, but on the sails of ships venturing into oceans no one had dared to cross. By the 15th century, Portugal had become the cradle of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, grandson of King Dinis, took command of the Order of Christ and turned it into the engine of discovery. Under his guidance, expeditions set out along the coast of Africa, probing further with each voyage. The sails of those ships bore the familiar Red Cross, the same symbol once carried by Templar knights into battle. It was as though the Order's mission had shifted from Jerusalem to the horizon, trading swords for compasses and maps. The influence of the Templars is hard to ignore. Their network of castles and ports had long connected Europe with distant lands. They had banking systems that spanned continents, and rumours persist that they possessed maps gathered in the East, perhaps even knowledge of lands across the Atlantic. When Henry's explorers discovered the Azores, Madeira, and the Cape Verde Islands, their precision seemed uncanny, as though they already knew where to look. The question lingers: did they sail with charts inherited from the fleet that vanished from La Rochelle? The legacy of the order continued even after Henry. Vasco da Gama, who reached India in 1498, sailed under the banner of the Cross of Christ. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, who landed in Brazil 2 years later, also carried it. Even Christopher Columbus sought support in Portugal before turning to Spain, and some of his ships were manned by men trained in traditions linked to the order. The Red Cross of the Templars had become the emblem of a new empire, stretching not across battlefields, but across oceans. Skeptics argue that Portugal's success came from investment, determination, and geography. And while those played their roles, the continuity between the Templars and the Order of Christ is undeniable. The knights who survived Philip's purge in France found a second life in Portugal, and their influence echoes in every discovery that followed. The age of discovery may not have been a sudden leap into the unknown, but the continuation of a mission centuries in the making. Stand today at Tomar and look at the convent built on Templar stone. Its walls are carved with ships and stars, its cloisters filled with symbols both sacred and secret. It feels less like coincidence and more like inheritance. The order that vanished from La Rochelle did not disappear, it simply changed sails, guiding Portugal into the age that reshaped the world. The cross of Christ was not new, it was the Templar cross reborn, carried from the ashes of suppression into the winds of discovery. The Knights Templar were warriors, but they were also bankers. Long before modern finance existed, they built a system that allowed kings, merchants, and pilgrims to move money safely across continents. A traveller could deposit coins in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem with nothing more than a coded slip of parchment. Their network of castles and commanderies functioned like branches of a bank, secure and efficient. By the time of their downfall in 1307, the Templars controlled one of the most advanced financial systems in Europe. When the order was destroyed, that system did not vanish. It resurfaced in new forms, and some believe the missing wealth of the fleet re-emerged not as chests of coins, but as the foundations of modern power. The genius of the Templar system was secrecy. Their codes and ledgers were indecipherable to outsiders. Kings could borrow vast sums, but the exact numbers were known only to the knights who kept their books locked away. When Philip IV arrested the order, part of his motive was debt. He owed them more than he could repay. Yet when his men stormed their vaults in Paris, they found them empty. Either the wealth had been moved in advance, or it had already been transformed into something less tangible. Land deeds, promissory notes, coded ledgers could hold more power than any pile of silver. After the suppression, the Templar estates were supposedly handed over to the Hospitallers, but records show much of the financial infrastructure slipped quietly into other hands. Some nobles and merchants who had ties to the order suddenly rose in power. In Switzerland, where legends say Templars found refuge, banking traditions soon flourished, rooted in secrecy and trust. To this day, Swiss banks are famed for confidentiality, a tradition some trace back to the mountains where fugitive knights may have hidden their records. It is also telling that certain families who were once allied with the order began to dominate finance in later centuries. Italian houses like the Medici, German banking dynasties, and networks of merchants in Flanders all appear to inherit fragments of Templar practice. The shift from coins to credit, from treasure to influence, matches perfectly with what the Templars had already mastered. If their missing fleet carried anything, it may have been records and instruments of finance, tools that would allow wealth to survive even when kingdoms fell. Skeptics insist that banking would have developed with or without the Templars, and perhaps it would have. But the sudden disappearance of one of the richest orders in Christendom, followed by the mysterious rise of secretive financial power across Europe, suggests continuity. The Templars may have lost their name, but their methods lived on, passed quietly from brother to brother, from ledger to ledger. Stand in the ruins of a Templar commandery and imagine the books that once lay open there. Not just records of grain or tithes, but codes linking Paris to Acre, London to Rome. If those books sailed away with the fleet, then the Order's greatest treasure was never gold. It was knowledge. Knowledge that money could move unseen, that power could be hidden in numbers, and that secrecy itself was the strongest vault. In that sense, the Templars may never have lost their fortune at all. They only changed how it was kept. Walk through the symbols of early America, and you will find patterns that feel older than the nation itself. Bees, stars, the compass and square, the all-seeing eye. These images appear on flags, seals, and architecture, woven so deeply into the fabric of the Republic that most people no longer question them. But for those who study the missing Templar fleet, These designs whisper of continuity. They look less like random choices of a young nation and more like echoes of a tradition that sailed from La Rochelle in 1307, hidden in ships that never returned to France. Consider the bees. In ancient symbology, bees stood for immortality, resurrection, and divine kingship. The Merovingians, long linked to Templar lore, used golden bees as their emblem, hundreds of them found in the tomb of King Childeric. Centuries later, Napoleon resurrected the bee as his imperial symbol, reaching back to a lineage deeper than the fleur-de-lis. In early America, the bee appears again. In Masonic lodges, it represents industry and unity, but its deeper resonance feels familiar. Some seals of colonial groups bore bees in clusters, a quiet nod to something more ancient than the Revolution. Then there are the stars. The American flag's constellation of 13 stars may simply represent the colonies, but the arrangement in circles and patterns mirrors designs found in Templar manuscripts and later in Masonic iconography. To some, the stars stand for guidance, a celestial map, a reminder of voyages across the Atlantic long before Columbus. If the fleet carried maps of the New World, those stars may have marked the way. The compass and square are perhaps the clearest link. As central symbols of Freemasonry, they represent geometry, order, and the building of society. But Freemasonry itself has long been tied to Templar survival. In Scotland, where the knights may have fled, Masonic lodges first appeared with uncanny timing, carrying symbols of sacred architecture that echoed the order's hidden traditions. By the 18th century, many of America's founding fathers were Freemasons. George Washington laid the cornerstone of the Capitol building in a Masonic ritual, wearing an apron embroidered with the same compass and square. To the public, it symbolized reason and progress. To those who knew the older code, it may have been a continuation of vows whispered centuries earlier. The all-seeing eye, placed above a pyramid on the Great Seal, is another unsettling symbol. Officially, it represents providence, yet its triangular form and radiant light echo designs from alchemical texts and Rosicrucian imagery, themselves often tied back to Templar survival. Was it simply coincidence, or did those drafting America's identity draw deliberately from secret traditions preserved in Europe, carried across the Atlantic by descendants of the fleet? Skeptics say these symbols were chosen for their universal appeal, their simple power to inspire, and that is partly true. But when so many align with the imagery of secret societies already linked to the Templars, the coincidences pile up. The missing fleet may not have left gold buried on islands, but it may have left a legacy coded into symbols, waiting to reappear when a new nation was ready to rise. Stand in Washington, D.C., and look at the architecture, the stars, the bees, the compass, and square etched in stone. They are not just decorations, they are reminders. Perhaps the fleet never vanished at all. Perhaps it survived in secrecy, leaving behind not treasure chests, but the symbols of America itself. The image of a pirate is burned into history. Black sails on the horizon, the Jolly Roger snapping in the wind, and men swearing loyalty not to kings but to their own code. The golden age of piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries filled the Caribbean with such figures, men who plundered treasure fleets and carved out secret havens on hidden islands. But behind the chaos, the rituals, and the symbols, some see the shadow of something older. They believe that the golden age of piracy carried echoes of the vanished Templar fleet. The most obvious clue is the flag itself. The skull and crossbones was no ordinary design. To the Templars, it had once been a sacred memento mori, a reminder that life is fleeting and death is inevitable. Centuries later, it reappeared as the banner of pirates, meant to terrify enemies into surrender. Yet the similarity is too precise to ignore. Pirates did not invent the symbol. They inherited it, perhaps unknowingly, from traditions carried across generations. The missing Templar fleet may have taken their emblems to sea, and over time those emblems transformed into the dreaded Jolly Roger. Pirate crews also lived by codes that seem strangely structured. They divided plunder fairly, punished betrayal swiftly, and often elected their captains rather than submitting to absolute authority. These practices echo the chapter meetings of the Templars, where discipline and collective decision-making were core to their order. To outsiders, pirates were outlaws. To those who looked closer, they were men following rules, hidden beneath a mask of rebellion. The Caribbean itself holds traces of this link. Some pirate havens bore names and symbols tied to Europe's older mysteries. In Tortuga and Nassau, flags with variations of the cross were recorded flying beside skulls. Certain captains carried rings and amulets etched with symbols that resembled those of the temple, crosses with equal arms, stars of 8 points, or Bs. To most, they were decorations. To a few, they may have been quiet signs of heritage. There are even stories of pirate treasure hunts that sound eerily like Templar legends. Maps marked with X's, islands booby-trapped with flooding tunnels, vaults guarded by riddles. These tales mirror Oak Island in Nova Scotia and the engineered shafts that some say were built by the Templars themselves. If the fleet had travelled west, hiding wealth in secret caches, then pirates may have stumbled upon the remnants, adapting the same designs in their own buried hoards. Skeptics argue that pirates were practical men who borrowed symbols to frighten their victims, but the persistence of Templar-like imagery, from flags to rituals, suggests more than coincidence. It suggests survival through transformation. The Templars, once Knights of Christ, may have re-emerged centuries later as outlaws of the sea, blending their secrecy with the lawlessness of the New World. Picture a Caribbean night, the sea glowing under the moon, a pirate ship anchored off a hidden cove. In the captain's cabin, a candle burns, illuminating a crude cross carved into the wood, a relic of a tradition no crewman fully understands. Outside, the Jolly Roger flutters, a skull staring into eternity. To the world, it is piracy. To history, it may be the last disguise of the missing Templar fleet. In the dark years of the 20th century, another empire rose, one obsessed not only with conquest, but with myth. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler and his inner circle, scoured Europe for relics they believed would grant them legitimacy, power, and a connection to something ancient. Their search for the Holy Grail, the Spear of Destiny, and other mystical treasures is well documented. But hidden within those quests is a quieter thread, the idea that the Third Reich hunted for remnants of the Templar legacy. Some believe they may even have stumbled upon traces of the missing fleet. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, founded the Ahnenerbe, an institute dedicated to uncovering the supposed ancestral heritage of the German people. Its expeditions travelled from Tibet to Iceland, from the Middle East to the Pyrenees, searching for evidence that could tie Nazi ideology to ancient roots. Among its many missions was an interest in the Templars. Himmler saw the Knights as predecessors, a brotherhood of warriors bound by secrecy, guardians of lost knowledge. SS castles were redesigned with symbols that echoed Templar architecture, from octagonal towers to crypt-like chambers where rituals were staged. One of the most haunting overlaps comes from the south of France. Nazi teams during the occupation investigated Rennes-le-Château and Montségur, both sites long tied to Templar and Cathar legends. Local accounts describe German officers probing caves, excavating ruins, and seizing manuscripts. What exactly they found remains unknown, but their interest reveals that they believed something lay hidden in these landscapes, perhaps even connected to the fleet that had fled La Rochelle centuries earlier. There are rumours that in the chaos of the war, Nazi units uncovered documents referring to Templar voyages westward, coded maps, or genealogical charts linking ancient bloodlines to European nobility. Some whisper that crates of seized materials were shipped back to Wewelsburg, Himmler's fortress-like headquarters, where they vanished into the war's final days. Allied forces did recover strange archives after Germany's defeat, but many were destroyed or locked away, fueling suspicion that part of the Templar mystery had been touched, if not fully uncovered, by the Reich. Skeptics argue that Nazi treasure hunts were more propaganda than reality, that their obsession with relics was theatre meant to legitimize their empire with borrowed myth. Yet the consistency of their focus on Templar sites is difficult to ignore. Why dig in southern France, if not for something more than folklore? Why remodel SS strongholds with Templar patterns if the order held no significance? Even if they found nothing tangible, their pursuit suggests that the shadow of the missing fleet still haunted Europe 6 centuries later. Picture the war-torn fields of France, where soldiers marched under swastikas, while officers slipped into abandoned churches, tracing carvings with gloved hands, whispering of knights, relics, and fleets long gone. In the ruins of Montségur, where Cathars once fell to fire, German archaeologists searched for a grail that might never have existed. Whether they found anything or not, the Nazis added another layer to the mystery, proving that even in the modern age, the ghost of the Templars still lured men into obsession, and perhaps, somewhere among their lost files, lies a clue to the fate of the fleet. Step into a Masonic lodge, and you enter a world of symbols, rituals, and secrecy that feels older than the Enlightenment age in which Freemasonry officially appeared. Candles flicker, aprons are worn, oaths are spoken, and symbols like the compass, square, and all-seeing eye decorate the walls. Among these traditions linger curious echoes of something even older, imagery tied to both the sea and the temple. Nautical references appear in lectures, anchors, and ship's surface in Masonic art, and the red cross of the crusading knights finds new life in degrees of the order. For some, this is proof of continuity, that the vanished Templar fleet did not simply vanish, but re-emerged, disguised as ritual, preserved in the hidden codes of Masonry. The connection between Templars and Freemasons has long been debated. Officially, Masonry grew out of medieval stonemason guilds, men who built cathedrals and passed down tools of geometry as moral lessons. But in Scotland, where the Templars may have fled after their fall in 1307, early records of lodges appear curiously close to Templar estates. Rosslyn Chapel, built by the Sinclair family in the 15th century, is filled with carvings that blend Christian, pagan, and nautical symbols. It is often seen as the bridge between the Knights and the Masons. Within Masonic rites, nautical imagery feels out of place if their roots were only in stonework. Anchors, ships, and voyages recur in their teachings, suggesting the memory of a fleet that once carried more than cargo. Could this be the ghost of La Rochelle, encoded into allegory? Masons speak of journeys across stormy seas toward the light of knowledge, language that mirrors both spiritual pilgrimage and physical voyages across the Atlantic. For those who see a Templar survival, these are not coincidences, but deliberate continuities. The whispers of sailors who became initiates, passing down memory in the only safe way left, as ritual. At higher degrees, the Templar imagery becomes even clearer. The Knights Templar degree in the York Rite, for example, directly invokes the order, complete with crosses, swords, and oaths reminiscent of the medieval brotherhood. To critics, this is romantic borrowing, an 18th century invention meant to link Masonry to a noble past. But to believers, it is evidence that the Templars' secret societies, perhaps formed by the fleet, evolved into Freemasonry, adapting their practices to survive persecution and time. The question remains whether these symbols are genuine continuity or myth layered upon myth. It is easy to imagine sailors from the fleet passing on traditions to guilds sympathetic to their plight, embedding nautical and sacred imagery into rituals. Equally, it is possible that Freemasons later adopted Templar myths to elevate their mystery. Yet the overlap is striking. Ships in ritual, compasses in stone, crosses in banners, all tied together by secrecy and brotherhood, hallmarks of the order that vanished in 1307. Picture a lodge in the 18th century, A candlelit room, men swearing vows of secrecy, as anchors and ships are carved into the walls, as swords flash in ritual arcs, and as the compass and square rest beside the Bible. To the outsider it is theatre, to the initiate it is tradition, and to the historian it may just be the last surviving echo of a fleet that sailed into legend, its memory hidden in plain sight within the rites of masonry. Off the coast of Nova Scotia lies Oak Island, a place that has captured imaginations for more than 2 centuries. At first glance, it is a quiet, wooded island, but beneath its soil lies one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history. The story begins in the late 1700s, when a group of boys discovered a depression in the earth. They dug, expecting perhaps a simple well, but instead found layers of wooden platforms set at regular intervals. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Eventually, the site became known as the Money Pit, a name that promised treasure but delivered only frustration. Over the years, countless expeditions have sunk fortunes into the island. Each time, diggers uncovered something that deepened the mystery. Coconut fibres were found buried in the soil, far from any place coconuts could naturally grow. Wooden platforms appeared every 10 feet, as though deliberately placed to deter digging. Strange stones carved with cryptic symbols were unearthed, one of which supposedly read 40 feet below, £2 million are buried. Water-filled tunnels were discovered, engineered in such a way that they would flood the pit whenever attempts were made to reach the bottom. Whoever built the system clearly wanted whatever lay beneath to remain hidden. The question is, who had the means and the motive to create such an elaborate underground vault centuries before modern machinery? For many, the answer points to the Templars. If the missing fleet crossed the Atlantic in the early 1400s, Oak Island could have been one of their chosen hiding places. The coconut fibres may have been used in ship rigging, carried from the Mediterranean. The wooden platforms and flood tunnels mirror the kind of defensive engineering the Templars were known for in castles and fortresses. Even the cryptic carvings fit the Order's tradition of coded messages, legible only to those initiated. Modern digs have produced even more tantalizing evidence. Fragments of parchment have been pulled from the flooded depths, inked with what appear to be medieval letters. Pieces of metal, some believed to be of pre-Columbian origin, suggest activity on the island long before the official age of exploration. And then there are the symbols. Certain stones on the island are marked with crosses, triangles, and geometric shapes that some link directly to Masonic and Templar iconography. To skeptics, these are coincidences, perhaps the result of later treasure hunters leaving their own marks, but to believers, they are the fingerprints of the fleet. Despite all this, no definitive treasure has ever been found. The Money Pit remains elusive, swallowing machinery, men, and money in equal measure. Yet the legend endures because the clues refuse to vanish. The coconut fibres, the wooden platforms, the strange stones, they are real, physical, and undeniable. Whether they prove Templar presence is uncertain, but they suggest that someone long before Columbus engineered something extraordinary on Oak Island. Stand on its shore today, and you feel the weight of centuries. The wind rattles the trees, the ground beneath hides its secrets, and the pit waits, flooded and silent. If the Templars truly sailed across the Atlantic, Oak Island may be their most enduring monument, a vault not of stone but of earth and water, guarding a secret that still refuses to be unearthed. Scattered across Europe's archives lie a handful of curious letters, written in the years following the Great Purge of the Templars in 1307. They are not dramatic confessions of heresy or papal decrees of suppression. Instead, they are quiet mentions, almost casual notes, about ships that left La Rochelle but were never accounted for. These letters, penned by clerks, bishops, and officials, should have raised alarms, yet for centuries they have been ignored, brushed aside as minor anomalies in the larger story of the Order's destruction. The question is why. One such letter, dated to the early 1400s, comes from a French royal clerk, who complained that certain inventories of Templar property could not be completed. The reason he gave was simple but puzzling. Several ships that should have been seized were missing, their crews gone, their cargoes unlisted. Another letter, preserved in a Spanish collection, speaks of vessels believed to have sailed west in haste just days before the arrests. It notes that, despite inquiries, no records of their return had ever been received. A third, from England, mentions rumours that Templar ships had been seen in the Channel long after their supposed disappearance, but that no portmaster could confirm their docking. These scattered fragments, if taken seriously, would provide direct evidence that the fleet did not vanish into myth, but into action. Yet mainstream historians rarely discuss them. Some claim the letters are misdated, others that they were exaggerated rumours, written down by officials eager to excuse missing taxes or unpaid debts. But their consistency across borders is hard to ignore. Different men, in different lands, all speak of Templar ships that slipped from record and never returned. Why then are they treated with such indifference? Perhaps because to acknowledge them is to admit that the fleet was real and deliberate, that the Templars did not crumble overnight under Philip's command, but prepared their escape with precision. If those letters are accurate, they imply that not only treasure, but men, records, and perhaps relics were carried away under the cover of darkness. Such an admission would unravel centuries of certainty, replacing it with the possibility of survival. The silence may also be deliberate. If the papacy or crown knew the truth, then burying these references in dusty archives would be the simplest way to erase the trail. Historians working in later centuries may have simply followed that lead, repeating the official story while ignoring the stray letters that complicated it. Absence, after all, is easier to explain than mystery. Picture a scribe in a dim hall, writing by candlelight. He scratches a note about ships unreturned, ink drying on parchment that he believes will never matter beyond his ledger. He has no idea that 7 centuries later, researchers will pore over his words, wondering why no one followed up. The letters remain, faint voices in the dark, pointing toward ships that vanished from the docks of La Rochelle and into history. Ignored, perhaps, because the truth they hint at is too unsettling, that the fleet did not die, it departed. In the past, the hunt for the missing Templar fleet meant trudging through ruins, sifting through crumbling parchments, or diving into flooded pits on remote islands. Today, the search looks different. Instead of shovels and lanterns, the tools are algorithms and digital archives. Thousands of medieval documents, once locked away in monasteries or royal libraries, are now being scanned and uploaded. And within that tide of data, researchers are beginning to notice something strange. Patterns, gaps. Anomalies that suggest the truth of the fleet may not be buried in the earth, but hidden in lines of text. Artificial intelligence has been trained to comb through shipping logs, tax records, and letters from the early 1400s. Where human scholars might tire or overlook details, AI compares every date, every name, every entry across hundreds of sources at once. What emerges is unsettling. Some ports list ships arriving from La Rochelle with no corresponding record of departure. Others show vessels registered under names that vanish abruptly, with no later mentions in naval rolls. There are clusters of data where references to Templar property stop suddenly, as though edited out. To a machine, these irregularities light up like red flags. One example comes from digitized logs of Bordeaux. Entries from 1307 show sudden omissions, with ships listed as inbound, but with their cargoes marked unknown. Months later, there are references to debts owed for vessels that supposedly no longer existed. Another anomaly appears in England, where AI flagged the same ship name appearing in separate records on the same date, once in the Channel and once off the coast of Portugal. Human error, perhaps, or a deliberate attempt to confuse anyone tracking the fleet's movements. Even more intriguing are the letters between clerks and Crown officials, long dismissed as routine. By running them through natural language processing, subtle patterns of wording emerge. Certain phrases, such as "in God's protection" or "for the temple's sake," appear disproportionately in correspondence from coastal towns during the very months of the arrests. To human eyes, they read as piety. To algorithms, they look like code, a quiet way of noting the movement of something important without saying so directly. The Vatican archives, slowly digitized in small fragments, also hold tantalizing hints. While only a fraction of their records are public, scholars using AI to analyze indexes and catalogues note peculiar absences. Whole sections of maritime correspondence between the papacy and France are missing or mislabeled. In some cases, the metadata shows that files were reclassified in the 19th century, long after their creation. Why move them unless they contained something inconvenient? Of course, skeptics argue that AI can find patterns where none exist, that gaps in records are inevitable after 7 centuries, but the consistency of the anomalies suggests otherwise. Too many missing ships, too many mismatched entries, too many erased ledgers. Perhaps the real treasure of the fleet was not gold but knowledge. And now, in the digital age, it may finally be rediscovered. Not in the dirt of Oak Island or the stones of Rochelle, but in databases, algorithms, and code. The Templars were masters of secrecy. They knew how to hide in plain sight. But in a world where every scrap of parchment can be searched, their silence may not last forever. The truth could emerge not from ruins, but from data. When we look back at the puzzle of the missing Templar fleet, one detail stands out above all others. The stories never agree on where the ships went. Some say Scotland, where Robert the Bruce welcomed exiled knights and gave them a place to fight again. Others say Portugal, where the Order of Christ rose from the ashes of the temple and launched the Age of Discovery. Still others insist the fleet sailed west, across an ocean not yet charted, planting the seeds of mystery in places like Nova Scotia and even the Caribbean. For centuries, these theories have competed with one another, but what if they are not in conflict at all? What if the truth is that all of them are correct? A fleet does not need to move as one. If a dozen or more ships slipped out of La Rochelle under cover of night in October 1307, they could have scattered deliberately. Some would head north, others south, others west, each carrying a portion of the Order's treasure, knowledge, or people. Such a plan would make sense for an organization skilled in secrecy and survival. By scattering, they reduced the risk of complete loss. If one group was captured, the others could continue. Survival would not depend on a single voyage, but on many, spreading the Order's legacy across seas and generations. In Scotland, the legend of mysterious knights appearing at Bannockburn fits this model. A small group of ships could easily have made landfall there, their men offering their swords in exchange for protection. The story of their sudden charge in the battle, whether literal or symbolic, represents a thread of the fleet's fate. In Portugal, the rebirth of the Templars as the Order of Christ is harder to dismiss as coincidence. Ships carrying documents, maps, and wealth could have reached safe harbour there. Under the protection of King Dinis, the Order endured, and its red cross later adorned the sails of explorers who reached India, Brazil, and beyond. This suggests that another portion of the fleet may have been folded into the new Portuguese identity, their knowledge preserved and expanded into global power. And then there are the stories of the Atlantic. Oak Island's mysterious tunnels, Rosslyn Chapel's carvings of New World plants, and the strange appearance of European artifacts in pre-Columbian contexts all point to voyages that predated Columbus. Even if only a handful of ships sailed west, their impact would ripple for centuries, fueling legends of buried treasure and secret colonies. The idea of a deliberate scattering ties the story together. It explains why fragments of Templar influence appear in so many places. It accounts for the scattered symbols, from bees and stars to skulls and crosses, that echo across continents. It turns what once looked like contradictory myths into pieces of a larger design, Picture it now. The night of October 13th, the fleet leaving La Rochelle in silence, lanterns dimmed. The ships do not form one line, but diverge into many, some to the north, some to the south, some into the vast unknown of the west. Each captain carries his charge, whether it be treasure, relics, scrolls, or perhaps people whose survival mattered more than gold. They vanish not into one destiny, but into many. And in doing so, they ensured that their order could never truly be erased. The fleet may not have disappeared, it may simply have scattered, leaving its legacy written not in a single place but across the world. For centuries, the missing fleet of the Templars has sparked one question above all others. Where did it go? Did it vanish into the mist of Scotland, find refuge in Portugal, or sail west into the great unknown? But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question all along. The greater mystery is not where the fleet went, but why it left. What purpose drove those ships to slip silently out of La Rochelle in October 1307, carrying with them men, treasure, and secrets that would never be recorded again? One answer is flight. The Templars knew that King Philip's purge was coming, that the mass arrests would wipe out their order in France. The fleet may have been their escape route, a desperate bid to survive when the land was no longer safe. But if it was only about survival, why carry so much with them? Why risk whole convoys instead of scattering in silence? Survival explains the exodus, but not the planning. Another answer is protection. Perhaps the fleet was not fleeing for its own sake, but for the sake of what it carried. If the knights held relics from Jerusalem, secret gospels, or documents proving inconvenient truths, then their mission was less about running and more about hiding. By scattering across seas and continents, they could ensure that the most dangerous knowledge of their age did not fall into the hands of king or pope. In this sense, the fleet was a vault, moving not to save itself, but to protect something greater. And then there is preparation. Some believe the Templars knew their time as a public order was over, but that their mission was not. The fleet's departure may have been the beginning of a long transformation, a shift from visible knights to hidden custodians. From this view, the scattered ships were seeds planted in distant lands, designed to sprout centuries later in the form of secret orders, global networks, and empires disguised as kingdoms or even nations. If so, then the mission did not fail. It succeeded so well that its legacy is still with us, hidden in plain sight. What that legacy is depends on who you ask. To some, it is the rise of banking systems rooted in Templar practices, financial power that shapes our world to this day. To others, it is the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, reborn in the sails of explorers who mapped the globe. To others still, it is the quiet persistence of symbols, from Masonic compasses to stars and bees carved into stone, reminders that ideas never really die, they adapt. So the final question lingers. Were the Templars simply running from a king's wrath, or were they guardians of something too dangerous to leave behind? If the fleet succeeded in its mission, then the world we live in may already carry its legacy, threaded through our institutions, our myths, and our symbols. Perhaps the greatest secret of the Templars is not buried in the depths of Oak Island or locked in Vatican vaults. Perhaps it sails quietly still, hidden in our flags, our cities, and the rituals we no longer question. The fleet may be gone, but its wake still ripples through history, reminding us that some mysteries do not end, they endure.